Welcome. Hi, I'm Mikki, and this is Mikkipedia, where I sit down and chat to doctors, professors, athletes, practitioners, and experts in their fields related to health, nutrition, fitness, and well-being. And I'm delighted that you're here. Hello everyone, it's Mikki here, and you are listening to another episode of Mikkipedia. Today on the podcast, I am stoked to bring to you the conversation that I had with Robb Wolf, the OG of this whole Paleolithic and ancestral nutrition space. Robb Wolf is a former research biochemist and 2 times New York Times and Wall Street Journal best-selling author of The Paleo Solution and Wired to Eat. And I've got to say, The Paleo Solution was my first introduction to writing in and around the paleo diet, and it really helped inform some of the key changes, I suppose, that I made to how I advocate nutrition back in the day. He also co-authored Sacred Cow, a book he wrote with Diana Rogers, which explains why well-raised meat is good for us and good for the planet. Now, we talk a little bit about this today in the podcast, but much more so we talk about ancestral nutrition, ancestral health, and Robb's journey in that space. Robb has transformed the lives of hundreds of thousands of people around the world via his top-ranked iTunes podcast, which is the Healthy Rebellion Radio, and I have links to that and his books in the show notes. And he is known for his direct approach and ability to distill and synthesize information to make the complicated stuff easier to understand. And I'm sure that you will get a taste of that in our conversation. So if you are unfamiliar with Robb, you are in for a real treat. And if you know of Robb and already consume his information, this will just add to that body of knowledge that you already have and that you know that Robb can provide. So I hope you enjoy this podcast. And just before we kick on into it, I'd like to remind you that the best way to support us is to subscribe on your favorite podcast platform if you don't already, and share it with your mates. And another way, if you felt like going that extra mile, is to sign up to one of the meal plans or the recipe portal access that I have over on MikkiWilliden.com, my website, where you get access to over 800 recipes which are frequently updated, a weekly email from me, you get access to the members only Facebook page where we do written forums, and you get the access to my brain for me to answer any of your nutrition related questions. And also head over to my website to put your name in a little pop-up box to get a free download to my protein ebook, where I can help you make better decisions around real food nutrition, which does not cost the earth. Alrighty team, I hope you enjoy this conversation that I have with Robb Wolf about ancestral nutrition, ancestral health, and building community. Sweet, Robb. So should I just kick off? Is that all right?
Sure, that's perfect. Yeah.
Awesome, cool. Robb, awesome to have you on the show, and I've been wanting to do this for, well, basically forever, but then I overanalyzed it. It just took me too long. So thank you for making the time. It's awesome, particularly because, well, one, you're Robb Wolf, and you're like the OG, aren't you?
I am getting pretty old. I think my driver's license has hieroglyphics on it, or, something to that effect. Yes.
Yeah, I know. Actually, as I was thinking about that and thinking about, what I'd love to chat to you about, I just wondered whether paleo and ancestral health, like how much it even existed before you were actually part of it, because it feels like it has been that long, because you're obviously the introduction for so many people.
When I stumbled onto this idea in 1998 and I found Loren Cordain's very early work, I think he only had the one main paper published at that time, Cereal Grains, Humanities, Double-Edged Sword, or maybe I even found him before that. But I want to say that there were maybe a couple of hundred people around the world that had this idea of like a paleo diet and ancestral health, but they were mainly researchers in and around like medical anthropology and whatnot. There were a few a very few physicians that were tackling things from kind of a evolutionary biology, ancestral health perspective. Ironically, a physician out of Australia was one of the main inspirations for Loren Cordain's early work. And I'm forgetting the gentleman's name, but in the 1960s, he postulated the existence of zonulin, which ended up being this really critical, protein in the gut. And he foretold there will be, he didn't call it zonulin, but he described it. It's kind of like when they, physicists say there will be this particle and it will have this mass and this, momentum and everything. But he described all these characteristics of zonulin and that it would be critical in the autoimmune process and that it would emanate from the gut. And then unfortunately, I believe this physician ended up dying and in an automobile accident or something like that. So his work was largely lost to the world. This was very much before the internet and whatnot. And so he had started to develop some clinics exploring the autoimmune gut connection and whatnot. And this was a major feature of Loren Cordain's work, in kind of postulating forward that there was this gut autoimmunity axis that existed. And it was this physician's work from the 1960s who had foretold the existence of zonulin and leaky gut and all this type of stuff. But I mean, in the late 90s, early 2000s, there wasn't a paleo diet book category, that didn't exist. There was low carb for sure, kind of Atkins and whatnot. And that would probably be the closest iteration for something akin to the ancestral health, approach. Yeah.
Rob, what even, when you think back, because I've heard your origin sort of story several times about your significant health issues. What was it actually got you to, that led you to look at diet? Because, and I know obviously, people did that, but what was that for you?
So I had ulcerative colitis, and a very severe case of ulcerative colitis. I'm about 170 pounds. I'm 5'9", 170 pounds. At the low ebb of the ulcerative colitis, I was about 125, 130 pounds. So if you imagine, 40, 50 pounds less of me, I was in pretty dire straits. And it was right around this time that my mother, who had suffered for as long as I could remember, my mom was sick as early as I could remember. Looking back now, kind of metabolic issues and also some autoimmune and gut issues, but she was diagnosed with celiac, rheumatoid arthritis, Sjogren's, about 8 different interrelated autoimmune conditions. And her rheumatologist said that he suspected that she was reactive to grains, legumes, and dairy. And at the time, I was eating kind of a high carb, low fat vegan diet, which I think for some people might work. For me, it was definitely a disaster, particularly living in Seattle and trying to be a grad student and, all this other, kind of stressful type stuff layered on top of it. But it was particularly bad for me. But I sat there thinking, gosh, if one does not or cannot eat grains, legumes, and dairy, what on earth would you eat? And it was kind of this free association that I was thinking, okay, well, grains, legumes, and dairy, that's kind of agriculture, and what did we do before agriculture? That was the Paleolithic and hunter-gatherers. And so I had heard this term Paleolithic diet, and I went into the house and turned on my computer and waited for it to, the hamsters to come alive inside of it. And there was this shiny new search engine called Google. And into Google, I put the term Paleolithic diet. And that's where I found early work from Loren Cordain and also a really brilliant economist, Art Devaney. And that was kind of the first go through on this, but it was kind of finding the clinical, ramifications of someone, my mom in particular, who was reactive to virtually all the regular foods that we are told to eat, and then thinking about what are the implications there? And then clearly it was fairly obvious that I had much similar issues to my mother, just not as advanced. And so I've always been fascinated by evolutionary biology. As a small kid, I really, was interested in it. And so I think I just had a predilection towards looking at the world in that way. And then when I shifted my eating in this direction, and it was such a profound, it's N=1, but it saved my life. And then I started working with people and discovering that a lot of folks had gut and autoimmune issues. Like just getting someone to lose weight, there's a lot of different routes to that endpoint. But if somebody has both metabolic disease and complex gut and autoimmune issues, I think that the number of tools available are very limited. Like the options there are much more limited. When the online diet wars, people will just say, well, you need match protein, and then it doesn't really matter what else you eat. And I think that that's probably true for most people under just the circumstance that our standard is just weight loss. But when we add in dealing with complex health issues, particularly gut issues, I think that this ancestral health kind of perspective ends up being really important to use as kind of a guidepost along the way.
And did you follow like the full autoimmune protocol as it might stand today? Like what are your views on that? Because a lot of people look at it like that is way too extreme, but maybe extreme is what some people need.
Yeah, it's funny. So when it is kind of cool looking back now. Like I've been eating this way for 23 years. My first book, The Paleo Solution, has been out 12 years now, I think. It will be 12 years this next year. So it is kind of crazy. But there was a time when there wasn't an autoimmune paleo protocol, and the first writing about an autoimmune paleo protocol was only a couple of paragraphs in the Paleo Solution, because my editor at the time was like, this is way too complex. We can't add this additional material in there. So I just kind of alluded to what the thoughts were with it, that the additional, layer of perhaps peeling fruits and vegetables, avoiding the seeds of fruits and vegetables, some of these things like nightshades, tomatoes, eggplants, those sorts of things, paprika, different spices might be also problematic. And it's interesting. I would say that the autoimmune paleo approach has helped a lot of people. Like that kind of ended up turning into the Walls protocol as kind of an offshoot, very, very similar to that. If you look at specific carbohydrate diet and a number of other approaches that have now been pretty well clinically vetted, like we have some good research on the autoimmune paleo approach, the Walls protocol, specific carbohydrate diet, and they all are remarkably similar in my mind. There's just an enormous amount of similarity there. I think they helped a lot of people, but I have to say, this crazy carnivore thing kind of blew me away, 5-6 years ago, because I fought this caricature around this whole, ancestral health story. It's like, oh, that's the guy that just recommends an all meat diet, and I would, just indignantly like, I eat lots of vegetables, and let me show you how many vegetables I eat. And then lo and behold, like I found this group of people online that they had done everything. These were folks that were really sick. And again, complex gut and autoimmune issues, usually rheumatoid arthritis and some sort of ulcerative colitis, combination. And these folks had done everything. Usually they found some iteration of kind of paleo and then keto and just out of desperation. I don't think anybody other than maybe 19-year-old knuckleheaded boys who think that they're going to get uber jacked, eating only steak, decide to do a carnivore diet as like the first whistle stop in nutritional modification. It just seems crazy that that's the first place that people go. But I found a bunch of people who had done everything. They did the autoimmune paleo approach. And it's like each thing kind of helped. Like it was certainly better than eating a standard American diet, but these folks were still sick. And then I found folks that had found some iteration of this carnivore approach, and they were healed, effectively. People get prickly about that term because it's like, well, can they still eat bread? No, that will still cause problems. So, what they've found is a way of mitigating their situation. And as the founder of the autoimmune paleo diet concept, I'm more impressed with the clinical efficacy of some flavor of carnivore than I am with because it almost reminds me of like the early history around like Judaism and Christianity, and like this one has a lot of rules, this one has a lot fewer rules and seems easier to do. And it kind of strikes me in that way because that AIP protocol is just mind-numbing in its complexity. Whereas like if you just flip it around and you go the opposite way, it's like just start with meat and seafood and like bone broth and then we'll work from there. It seems so much easier. It's psychologically, it seems easier. Physiologically, it definitely seems to work better. And then we can kind of iterate from there. Whereas if we start from the perspective of we're going to cut one more thing out and cut one more thing out and cut one more thing out, like that feels almost more depriving and difficult to do than like we're cutting everything out and, you know, like uber elimination diet. And then we'll backfill back into, you know, what degree of latitude the person has.
There's so many mental gymnastics that seem to go into the AIP, and what kind of bread can I make that's AIP, and how am I going to make this dessert, and what am I going to have for lunch, rather than it's just meat. So all of that decision burden is sort of gone, and it's almost, I can imagine for some people it would almost be like a relief, like, okay, well, I'm just going to try this and sort of see how it pans out. Yeah,
it's fascinating. I will say that I had eaten kind of some iteration of a keto approach for the better part of 20 years and had never really had food cravings. But the first couple of times I tried doing carnivore, I kind of freaked out. I was like, I want ice cream. I want this. I want that, you know? And so it for me, I had reached a point where I didn't feel particularly constrained. I felt like I had lots of latitude in what I was eating, but that initial shift, you know, to carnivore, which you wouldn't think it would be that big of a shift for someone like me, but it really psychologically was challenging for me. But lo and behold, I found that eating a little closer to that, like I'm really careful with the amount and types of vegetables that I consume. Like a green salad is just really not generally my friend. Like if I lived in Costa Rica and I just baked on a rock all day and had like zero, you know, stress and demands on me other than like spearfishing or something, I might do okay with that. But I do okay with some fruit. I do okay with a few different types of very well cooked vegetables, a little bit of root vegetables and whatnot. But I just found that I did better closer to a carnivore approach than you know, this very trying to do a very vegetable intensive, you know, iteration of like paleo or keto.
People are so uncomfortable with the idea of not eating vegetables and not getting your 5+ a day.
Yeah.
I think out of almost everything that you can recommend, people like absolutely get up in arms about it.
Yeah, it's funny, and it was weird for me too. And again, I felt like that was the only saving grace that I had as this kind of like paleo diet, keto diet advocate was like, no. I recommend that people eat lots and lots of vegetables and whatnot. And then, you know, over time, like we're both members of the Healthy Rebellion, and like we were kind of doing a bit of tallying in there, and I think like 25% of the folks in there eat some iteration of a carnivore-ish approach, and it's to manage complex health issues. And that's kind of remarkable. It's also not surprising. Like that's kind of my jam, you know, people with really, you know, complex poop issues just seem that's kind of where, you know, the crowd I draw in. So that's interesting. But yeah, it was weird for me, and I felt very uncomfortable recommending it, you know, or just acknowledging that like, hey, there might be something to this. But I just again and again saw folks go from comparatively compromised health to comparatively better health by making the shift. And you know, it's just that empirical part of it is kind of hard to beat.
Yeah, and I feel like I agree with you, because I've worked with a number of clients now, and we've worked on a like the carnivore approach, and they've seen some massive health benefits from it. And I think, as with anything, it's the disservice is sort of done when you've got the zealots out in social media space, you know, which might paint it. You know, you've always got people at the extremes and saying like, this is the way that everyone should eat, and I feel like that's where it does a disservice for the entire sort of people who might actually benefit from it.
Absolutely. And this is so much the challenge of social media. Like what does the algorithm reward? Controversy and conflict. And so people learn, through this like Pavlovian process to be kind of assholes about things, and then it's just like you're rewarded for that. You get the dopamine hit of more clicks, more interaction, more conflict. And so it's if our modern Western liberal democracies and civilization as we know it crater and end, and then some civilization rises after that and they're able to like go through and figure out what happened, they're like, oh, this social media thing, don't do that again. Like that was a terrible idea. Yeah.
And on that, Rob, was that sort of, because you mentioned the Healthy Rebellion, and I've been a member for, I think as soon as I saw the email come through, I'm like, yeah, I'll be a part of that. Part of it is because my personality is that I like to be involved and I like to be part of something. And I think you say you're known for AOP, and of course you are in paleo, but I feel like you're also known for that building community and creating a safe space for people who might not feel like they have that in other areas. Was that one of the sort of, I suppose, one of the reasons for you guys deciding to sort of take on this mission of the Healthy Rebellion?
Yes, and it was also, I don't know if you remember the backstory, but in 2017, my website, along with a good number of other websites within the ancestral health space, got kind of hoovered up in this Google OWL update. And it was one of the first really, Google had done this multiple times. Like for a long time, Google has been moving towards owning and curating health information. Like they want you to look at this thing and not necessarily the other thing. For a long time, they rewarded people like myself who would generate a lot of unique content and update it frequently and whatnot. And you end up with a high ranking, website, and lots of people find your stuff. But over the course of time, Google has put these kind of roadblocks into finding that kind of non-mainstream narrative, information offerings. And so one day in 2017, we kind of got up and we looked at our website analytics, and the web traffic had dropped by 97%. Like we just disappeared from the internet. It was still there, but like I had there's a vegan documentary film, Cowspiracy, and I forget if I did both Cowspiracy and What the Health, but I did a review of these films, and it's basically like minute by minute thing. Okay, the folks that Neil Bernard Shaw in the film makes this claim. Here's the thing that he cites for it. Here's my take on it. You know what I mean? An enormous amount of work, probably 90 plus hours of work to go through this thing. But when one would search for Cowspiracy or What the Health, you would find typically the film. And then within that first page of search, you would find my review, because I tried to be as impartial, I wasn't a huge jerk. I was like, okay, I think that they're right here and I think that they're wrong there. And I cited all my stuff. And it was a very popular piece because people wanted to read reviews of the film, and mine put 90 hours into reviewing it, into an analysis of reviewing it. That is still on the internet, but you need to put in Robb Wolf Cowspiracy, and then you might find it. But even then, it will be on like page 30 of a search return instead of like number 3, page 1 of a search return. So we realized at that point that, for whatever reason, and honestly, it's been interesting with like COVID and all the rest of this stuff, it's become more obvious why, Google and some of these entities are really trying to control and curate the information that is available to all of us. But I realized that I could spend a decade or two of work building this platform that then with the flick of a switch becomes effectively unfindable. So I wasn't deplatformed in that the website was gone, but if nobody can find your work, it's effectively the same thing. And so I kind of had a choice between, like going sacred cow, and just being a farmer and throwing in the towel. but I really felt like I still had something to offer in this health and wellness space. And that was the impetus for finding somewhere that seemed like the values of not just freedom of speech of the individual being able to say something, but the flip side of this is that the way that these information monopolies curate information, they're assuming that you are so addle-brained and so weak-minded that it's dangerous for you to read what I have to say, which I find that incredibly problematic. It's not, it goes above and beyond even the ability of the individual to say something. It's the ability of the society at large to experience what the individual has to say and then make a decision about whether or not they buy into that or not, or maybe if they completely disagree with it, then, formulate their response to it. And, that seems like a really healthy, dynamic type of community to build. And we seem to be heading in a very different direction from that. So that was really the genesis and the impetus for doing something like the Healthy Rebellion, because we just recognized that we were in this kind of information cul-de-sac that we could continue generating material and whatnot, and it might never really be found again, because we could play this song and dance of like updating all of our algorithmic, status with our website and which is kind of what we were told to do, but we did that and it didn't really change our position there. We never regained the reach that we had previously.
And so, Rob, has it turned out the way that you envisioned it would? Like, how has it, because it's been 2 years now, so how's it going?
Yeah, it's going really well. And honestly, I wasn't sure if anybody would show up. Like, it was just kind of a hope and a prayer that anybody would show up. I think it's gone far better than what my expectations were. It's reached a point where I try to be active in there, but I also try not to be there so much that it's just kind of like a wall of Rob. Like, I really do think that the hive mind is much smarter than any one individual. I think that, like we have some people like Jack Rustin in there who is just so smart, and not just smart with like the technical details of nutrition, but like his emotional intelligence is just incredible. And you have a few stewards or shepherds like that are able to keep the inmates from trying to shiv each other in the liver and stuff like that. And so by and large, it has been a really welcoming, warm, engaged area. We've been able to navigate discussions around some really complex socio-political stuff, COVID being kind of front and center, and a host of other things, climate change issues, the role of animal husbandry in the process of climate change. And the interesting thing is that because I think part of the reason why it works, there's a couple of reasons. There's a paywall. So some people paid some money to be there. So as big of assholes as there are in the world, like you really gotta want to do something to go, spend some chunk of money to show up and just be a troll somewhere. So I think that that's a big factor. So there's just more skin in the game and buy-in, right from the beginning. But then the fact that the platform is just people interacting with each other, there isn't an algorithm that's figuring out, well, this person and this person probably wouldn't get along at all. So I'm going to make sure that they both see each other's posts so that they hate each other maximally, and it's grown to I think a sustainable spot. Like, we weren't sure if 1,000 or 10,000 people would be good, and it seems like somewhere around that 1,500 people, 1,200, 1,500 people is good. It normalizes the ups and downs of just people checking in and checking out of a community like that. But I feel like if it got much larger, that it would lose the intimacy and you might have a tendency for people to be more crass and abusive and whatnot. And so if there was ever a need to expand it, I would just kind of create another entity, another Healthy Rebellion, and maybe Jack ran it or, something like that. Like, he would be kind of the steward of that. And that was kind of pretty quickly I had the thought that if this thing were to scale and replicate, that it would be as separate communities. And then maybe there's kind of a centralized hub where we can all kind of get together and kumbaya every once in a while together, but that by and large, these communities would have kind of their own sensibilities and feel and whatnot.
And it seemed to happen at such an important time as well. If I've got the timing right, wasn't it like a few months before COVID?
It was like 6 months before COVID.
Amazing.
The timing was crazy good for us, and I think it was good for a lot of the folks in there, because it has been kind of the single bastion for many people to just talk about what's going on. Oftentimes these folks can't talk with family, coworkers. They certainly have a hard time navigating anything online, like even asking questions, So yeah, the timing was kind of remarkable, and that's been a really weird. It's been a weird thing for me. Like COVID has been great for me. We had 2 businesses that we invested in early on that ended up getting acquired due to the growth that they had during COVID. Like financially, COVID's been amazing for me, but it's been this incredibly gut-wrenching experience to have to see happen, because we see how negatively this is affecting so many people in the world, and the folks in our community. So it's been this really weird thing for me. Like we lived in Texas for the first part. Now we live in Montana, and these places have been relatively open, and, our day-to-day life have been minimally impacted really in that regard. Because I work from home and do what I do, like that COVID has only accentuated, the things that I do there. It's only improved it. So you would think that I would be like the biggest, like, go COVID advocate. You could think like this has been great for us in a lot of ways, but we know more people who have committed suicide through the last 2 years than we do who died from the virus itself. And that may be reflective of just kind of the age and the demographic that we exist in. But, we've seen some really terrible things happen as a consequence to the kind of social pressure cooker that has occurred around all this. So, that's been tough, but it's been, when I'm feeling down, like if we have one of these group chats and I get to jump on the Healthy Rebellion chat, like I always feel better afterwards. Like it's really a pick me up and an awesome group of people.
Yeah. No, I completely appreciate that. And like you seem to do, like, I think about the things that you've done, Rob, and well, one, you seem to be an early adopter of lots of things, obviously, like CrossFit being the first affiliate and 4th affiliate gym. Wrote one of the first sort of mainstream paleo sort of books. And actually on that, you had Hamilton Staple on your show.
Yeah.
And this was, I can't recall if it was this year or the year before, things seem to blend. And I really enjoyed that conversation about, the state of ancestral health and where it is at now and sort of where it's going. If you think about where sort of paleo is now, which is almost like a dirty word. Like you can't say paleo without people going, oh, what the hell? Whereas 5 years ago, you could actually, that was still part of the normal, like a conversation that you could have with someone by using the term.
Right.
Where do you feel this is going? Or like, have you had any thoughts about it? Like in terms of the movement or the food side of things, or
it's Hamilton is just a great guy. Like he's a historian by training, and he really early on started asking some kind of thorny questions around all of this. He found some early parallels between the physical culture movement of the early 1900s and the ancestral health movement, and there was some cool stuff there. But then he started doing some analysis about like who was doing quote paleo and the likelihood of it going mainstream, getting more than 15% of the population involved and all that type of stuff. I guess some interesting things is that some pieces of the ancestral health model, like circadian biology and gut health writ large, really the ancestral health movement put those things on the map. Like they took them from being completely bogus quackery to being some of the hottest areas of, kind of physiology, immunology research, that's occurring at this point. So some of the offshoots have really, kind of taken root. it's interesting. So like Brett Weinstein and Heather Heying, they're evolutionary biologists, and they talk constantly about dynamic complex systems and the need for viewing things from an evolutionary biology lens. And they're fairly critical of like the paleo diet concept. I still would like to chat with them and see if they've read any of the early work on this, because like Cordain never said there was a paleo diet. What he ended up doing is going through the ethnographic atlas, which considered it was the best repository of information we have on the contemporarily studied hunter-gatherers, about 250 different groups, and our best understanding of the amounts and types of foods that they ate. And Lauren did a pretty nice job of kind of stratifying all of that, the amount of protein, carbs, fat, and did some correlations between latitude and whatnot. But it was more of a distribution of, here are some error bars that this general concept exists in. And yes, some of them consume some grains. Yes, some of them consume some dairy. But by and large, these are not like staples of the diet. And interestingly, they seem to have remarkably good health. Like Stefan Lindeberg, his work with the Katavan population was just amazing. He went from a population-based study of comparing the leptin levels of Katavans to Scandinavian, westernized individuals. And then he generated a hypothesis that the leptin resistance was driven by lectins from Neolithic foods. And then he did an animal model and then a human model. And I don't know that his proposition was 100% accurate. Like you could describe that same process. There's another wonderful paper, dense acellular carbohydrates being this problematic feature of Western diets. You could explain much of what we see with just the processing of carbohydrates and not necessarily the lectins per se, instigating leptin and insulin resistance. But man, it was a beautiful thing where it went from an observational epidemiological study that had 3 layers of refinement kind of auguring in and finding, strong correlation. Then we had an animal intervention that was done in pigs, which I think is a wonderful model for studying human physiology, because they're digestive, they're opportunistic omnivore. Their digestive physiology is very similar to ours. Their pancreatic function, very, very similar. So it was actually a brilliant move there. And that was a nice move. Then there was a clinical intervention in humans that showed, this benefit of a paleo type diet. And so it was really an elegant, process. Now we could probably find something similar that would work for a traditional Greek diet and a whole host of things relative to the modern industrialized diet. But I think that the paleo diet concept gets a really bad rap because folks just haven't read the primary research on it, and I think that maybe even Brett and Heather might fall in that camp. And I base that off of the things that they've said, that, there's not one paleo diet. And it's like none of the researchers in this scene ever said that. And they were quite emphatic to the opposite of that. But they provided kind of an aggregate. And then like, maybe if you operate within these bounds, here's some qualitative features of the food. And then as to the quantitative features, here are some boundaries to play with regards to protein, carbs, fat. Then, some good things should probably happen. And I think that that's been accurate. I do think that evolution via natural selection is a thing, and medicine is applied biology. And so someday we will have Darwinian evolutionary biology as a cornerstone of what we do. Like it may happen within this personalized medicine, thing that is occurring when you sit down with your doctor to think about your health strategies or whatnot. Like that individual is going to be thinking first principle wise about Darwinian evolutionary biology, and whatever your health situation is or what your goals are going to be oriented through that lens. So it's not just going to go away. It will end up having some I think greater influence there. But it's kind of funny where it would be like trying to do like GPS satellites would not work if we didn't have Einstein's understanding of relativity. Like, because of the difference where a satellite is relative to things on the Earth, time actually runs a little bit differently, like a little faster one location, a little slower other, and you need to do adjustments for that. Otherwise, like our geosynchronized, clocks around the world wouldn't work. And so the evolution via natural selection is as important as that. And part of the reason why our healthcare systems are such an absolute disaster, and our food systems are because we have just, for whatever reason, refused to make that kind of a front and center, element to the way that we look at the world.
And even though now, like, so the concepts sort of surrounding the paleo diet, whatever you would call it, like, it feels like there's more emerging research. Like, I mean, you're amazing at bringing like this study and this study and that, like, these just collections of studies seem to be coming out of the literature, and it feels to me like it's very well understood now in terms of, for example, full-fat dairy, like, actually is protective, appears to be protective on a population level, yet the dietary guidelines and the Ministry of Health guidelines will always state sort of low-fat dairy for anyone sort of under 2. Like, it feels like where the change needs to come for anyone, for the population that always look to things like the Ministry of Health in New Zealand here to get those recommendations. But it's just like that research is completely ignored.
Yeah, it's in the United States, I know it wasn't this last round of dietary guidelines updates. It was the one before, which is so weird because I think they do that every 5 years, and it feels like within my memory now they've done 2 of these updates. I'm like, oh my God, I'm getting old really fast. But saturated fat became not a nutrient of concern. And the same deal with dietary cholesterol. And this raised a good bit of hubbub, but this is pretty consistent with what the literature tells us, as far as where we should be, focusing efforts and whatnot. But so the dietary guidelines kind of got updated, but then the inertia within dietetics and center recommendations, like there are still folks, even though Ansel Keys said, oh, dietary cholesterol doesn't really affect serum levels, except in a very few people. People still look at things like eating eggs as being problematic for cholesterol due to the cholesterol in the egg. There definitely are some people that, with both dairy and saturated fat, seem to see a disproportionate increase in cholesterol and lipoproteins with consumption or overconsumption. So I think that there are some individual level or some niche population level things that we need to do a little bit of consideration around that. But yeah, it's funny, and this has been my kind of libertarian market, solution to all this stuff. One is just, if we generally have access to all the information available and we can talk about things, I think we're in a really good position to make great decisions. And I'm on, I guess, one side of a camp with this. The other side of the camp is that no, people are too dumb and too gullible, and they're going to make bad decisions. And so we need some gatekeeper intermediating in this, both online and in real life, to make sure that these idiots don't hurt themselves. And I just don't buy that. Like, absolutely, people will make decisions that are not good for them. But I think by and large, when the best information is available, people will move it. This is a decentralized emergent process, like an economy, like an ecology, and the best practices will ultimately kind of win out in that circumstance. And so I have more faith in, like, free access to information and people being able to hash out ideas, because you can lay it out there. It's like, hey, like, there are people in the ancestral health, particularly the ketogenic diet space, that, like, so long as you keep insulin levels low, you can't gain body fat. Like, that's a claim. Okay. These folks wear continuous glucose monitors. Their blood glucose never, ever, ever spikes up. And because they're eating a stick of butter, in a coffee 3 times a day and they're consuming like 4,500 calories, they are gaining weight. And so you can out this stuff, it's is it in a random, is it in a clinical trial setting? No, but we don't need a clinical trial. Like if I drop a hammer on my foot, it's going to hurt 100 times out of 100. There are some things, the effect is so powerful, that you don't need a million samples to ferret out a really subtle experience there. And I think that there's something similar to that, in this kind of emergent decentralization. At a minimum, I would love it if different countries had 3 or 4 different ministries of health that were all competing against each other. And so you've got part of the healthcare system, like however the insurance or, the healthcare delivery stuff is parceled out so that at least there's not a monopoly on this. Like one of the big criticisms of capitalism writ large is that you have these monopolies that need to be broken up and whatnot. And I'm kind of like, well, at the governmental level, why don't we break that up? Why don't we get some different entities that compete against each other for funding and resources? And then I think that you align the incentives in a way that we will figure out, okay, yeah, low carb diets are actually super effective for type 2 diabetes. And it may be challenging to get people to adhere to that. And that's another layer of this story. Like, how do we get compliance and we can start setting up incentives to make that, more palatable for folks. But, when we have a monopoly and kind of a feudalistic, ownership of information, I think that that's super dangerous. Like when we look back at the pre-Enlightenment period, when most people lived under feudal lords, it sucked. Life was not good, and we're somewhat there now with regards to information. Like information is to our life what land and water and food and whatnot were for the the agrarian society living under feudalistic lords. And so I think that that's part of the reason why Google and some of these other tech platforms have gone so heavy-handed in trying to suppress information around different approaches, whether it's COVID or low-carb diets or whatever. Like they're very, very prickly towards, paleo, keto, low-carb diets. I think in part because of the perception about how they play within the narrative of climate change. Which is that they're just uniformly bad, which I'm, I think I've got, where is it? Right there, sacred cow, I have a different perspective on that. Maybe I'm wrong, maybe I'm crazy, but, that's my attempt at creating some dialogue around that topic. So like, if I am wrong, okay, let's have somebody dig into that and let's get, their perspective on it so that we can hash that out. But, it's interesting the areas in which the information monopolies, the old guard media entities and whatnot, like it's kind of this iron wall, high carb, low fat, animal products are bad for humans, are bad for the environment. And I mean, it's just very uniform discussion. There's no upside to any of it. Decentralization is bad. We need to centralize, power so that the right people who understand the world can make the right decisions. And I just see a ton of potential problem with that.
Yeah, it's interesting. I was just reading your book yesterday as I was sort of thinking about things that I'd love to chat to you about, and particularly when it comes to animal agriculture and what we understand of the sort of environmental and the ethical and the health implications. And you guys are up against big players in that. And I'm not thinking about people who sort of share that same space, but you're up against movie stars, and producers with millions of dollars who are able to produce these really compelling movies.
Super slick.
That's enough for people. Totally.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's just wrong. And that whole idea, and I think about it from a clinical perspective and what I see out there in terms of what we understand about health, and the idea that plant-based is a healthy approach for people is such a disconnect to actually what we need for health. And I think that's the problem. in terms of sort of the individual and the information that they're getting, sort of, you know, social media and all the rest of it. It's a tough one. It's tough to be a health professional recommending that people eat meat.
Yeah, you're a crazy person, you know, and I, you know, as it is right now, and again, I don't want to steer it too much into COVID, but right now with COVID itself, for health concerns, we are in a situation where people feel justified in censoring folks, shutting them down, limiting access to shopping or you know food or a whole host of things. And I just don't see it being that large of a leap that, okay, maybe we kind of navigate through this. And it's like, well, within this whole COVID narrative, climate change and kind of social justice topics have been inextricably woven together. Like you find people who will say climate change caused the virus because we're encroaching on habitat, which doesn't appear to be the case, but you know, whatever, but this is the narrative. And, you know, evil capitalistic, you know, societies are the ones that are accelerating all this stuff. And it's kind of, it's a wonderfully airtight case. I think it's wrong, but like from an elevator pitch perspective, it's wonderful, you know? And then if you were to push back against that, if you say, well, actually, and properly applied animal husbandry could be a huge boon for both carbon sequestration and, at a minimum, mitigating desertification. If we allow this process to go a little bit further, then it's like, well, you're an enemy of the state because you're promoting a diet that is damaging the planet, and the claim is that it's going to end like human civilization. And so we were justified in shutting down all this stuff around COVID because every life matters and we need to save everybody and everything. And there's truth to that, but I think it gets twisted in kind of remarkable ways. And now we can't let people talk about animal husbandry being a potentially beneficial feature of the food system and the environment, because we all know that that's false. And so these people need to be silenced and deplatformed and, you know, on and on. And, you know, you mentioned that I've been early to a lot of things. Like it's kind of, I don't want to toot my horn too much, but there's so many things that my wife and I did, but we did it so early that it literally, it was like there wasn't even a box for people to figure this stuff out. Like we had a grass-fed, all organic frozen meals delivered company in 2007. And it just like, it was so early that people just, it did okay, but it was just way too early. And we have like lots and lots of stuff like that. And I've been right about enough stuff early enough that I really trust my own perspective on this. And I think that we're just at this like razor's edge now with regards to where this stuff could go with regards to health and the ability to just have free, open discourse and let the best hypothesis carry the day, you know, really let the data carry the day, not kowtowing to consensus or you know, expertise. And that sounds nuts, but if I'm going to go get a surgery, let's say I'm going to get LASIK eye surgery. So I'm going to find somebody who's graduated from medical school, and then they go through the ophthalmology program and whatnot. And then what I'm going to do is read a ton of reviews from people who have interacted with this person. You know, so at the end of the day, I'm kind of relying on the knowledge of both individuals, but on, you know, group analysis to find like the best eye surgeon that I'm going to go to. And I think that there, again, kind of a decentralized emergent processes can help us to find the best solutions for climate change issues, social issues, health issues. But the ironic flip side to this, what I'm recommending is something very local, very decentralized, very much honoring the local culture of wherever it is that things are happening, whether it's health or food production or whatever. The flip side of this, and you kind of laid this out, is that it is a homogenized, one-size-fits-all, kind of like one group in maybe Brussels or something, you know, World Health Organization that is dictating all of this to everybody in like this monochromatic fashion. And so we're supposed to assume that the the animal husbandry or the food or health or socio-political considerations in Northern Europe are going to be the same as Central America or in Africa. And Forbes had a really fascinating piece that basically made the case that these synthetic meat companies like Impossible Burger and whatnot are like the vegans are the best friends that big ag and big pharma have ever had, because they're pushing this narrative around super processed food that has nothing to do with sustainability, nothing really to do with health, but it's been greenwashed in such a way that it seems great, but it's actually consolidating all of the power, all of the kind of industry into the hands of a very few people versus, again, this kind of decentralized process.
Do you think that people understand that about like fake meat?
Not at all. Not at all. One of the, and this is kind of my wife is reading Carl Sagan's book, The Demon Haunted World, which he wrote in the early 90s. And it basically talks about the shocking lack of science literacy in society at large, but also specifically within our political structure. And I don't know about New Zealand, but in the United States, if you can find it, virtually everybody has a law degree who ends up in politics. Occasionally, you'll find a physician that ends up in politics, and they're usually like our scientist in there. Very, very rarely you'll find somebody who has an engineering degree or something like that. And that person, you're like, oh my goodness, how did they get here? But folks are so divorced from the way that the world really works, just fundamental principles of the way that the world works. So these lab grown meat ideas, people are like, yeah, that's great. Just grow that in a lab. And it's like, well, what does this stuff grow on? They're like, well, it just grows. And it's like, well, no, it doesn't just grow. You have to raise a bunch of row crops and then process it and turn it into maltodextrin and then protein concentrates and then feed that into a vat. And that vat needs to be temperature controlled so it doesn't get too hot, doesn't get too cold. You need to introduce antibiotics to it because otherwise it's basically a giant petri dish. And once you walk people through this thing, even that, they're kind of like, well, I mean, you could produce a lot of food like that, right? And then you walk them out into like a cornfield or something, or just a giant, field where you're raising cattle. And it's like, no, this is where you grow food at scale, So telling that story, I think we definitely did it in the book, but in the film, I'm not sure if we covered Grass World. But that was kind of our attempt because we were at a conference, Diana Rogers and I were at a conference, and we were early in the process of trying to write this book. And I'm like, my God, like people don't understand ecology at all. Like just the fundamentals of, there was a vegan philosopher professor who made the case that all predatory animals should be hunted to extinction because they're a bummer on the lives of non-predatory animals. And, basically that they're meanies, they're big meanies. And if we remove all these big meanies, then it'll be great. And the guy rightfully got eaten alive in that folks were like, yeah, and then the population of these animals will explode. And then where are you going to be? And then he said, well, we could introduce, like birth control on them. And this guy is suggesting that we're going to start trying to centrally manage the life cycle of global population of like herbivores versus, relying on 4.5 billion years of evolution on this earth and, plants, animals, herbivores, carnivores, or omnivores. It's crazy, and this guy has got to be super smart. He's well educated. He's kind of the creme de la creme of academia. And this guy didn't even have an inkling of what the implications were for what he was suggesting, and I don't think anybody would ever take this seriously, but he was really like sincere in this will reduce suffering on a global level because these poor animals that are being eaten by lions and tigers and bears won't be eaten by them. But, they will, there was no thought about the fact that they will outstrip the carrying capacity of their environment and then have a completely catastrophic population crash, possibly to the tune of like, mass extinction. And this is the stuff that we face is not only is, I think kind of the story that you and I try to portray around food and the environment and whatnot, very controversial and very much kind of heterodox to what the mainstream story is, but it's not an elevator pitch, 15-second, Walt Disney-ified, view of the world. There's complexities to it that I think people are interested in. I in years past, I would have said that people lack the attention span to do that. But with all the long format material that's available now, I think that's not the case. But it still is challenging to get that detail and nuance out there.
Rob, who would you recommend? If I think about the people in the space, and it feels like it's changed over time, like the people who are visible and sort of talking about this stuff, who would you recommend that people who this is actually like new material for them and they wouldn't know who to sort of start following in it? Aside from yourself, of course, who else is out there that you feel is a really good, trusted source of information in health and the state of things right now?
Yeah, I mean, Diana Rogers, a dear friend of mine, and she's really uniquely positioned. She's a dietitian by training, but she co-authored Sacred Cow with me, and really, she spearheaded that thing. Like she drugged me kicking and screaming through that thing. At the end of the day, I didn't ultimately want to do it, but she knew that this was something that had to be done. But Diana is really kind of the Johnny on the spot with all this stuff. So she's really tied into how beneficial an animal inclusive diet is to women and children in particular. And she's just like unrelenting in, you're going to have a hell of a time, raising a healthy baby and a healthy mom on like a vegan diet, and she has the data and she has the experience to really back that stuff up. And then if you navigate that chunk of the story, and then you have some questions and concerns around like the environmental and ethical considerations of that, meat inclusive food system. This is her life. Like she lives it. She lived on a small regenerative farm for 15 years and is friends with like everybody in this space, and her circle of influence grows. So like we met some folks that live in Mexico, and we linked them up with the guy that we featured in the film, who's doing regenerative ag out in the Chihuahuan desert and has restored 1 million acres of desert and got it turned back into grassland. So Diana Rogers is definitely somebody I would check out for just really practical how to do it, nutrition information to just kind of healthy weight, good body composition, good performance. Like she's really streamlined and on point with that. And then she really is the queen bee as to, the information around regenerative ag and all that type of stuff.
Awesome. No, that's awesome, Rob. And finally, because we're almost out of time, but I really just wanted to know, how's Element going? I mean, it's amazing. It's like the most amazing product I think I've come across. It's
going really well. It's crazy. I would have never... 5 years ago, I would have never thought that I was going to be selling salt to people. Like it was, it's kind of funny. This is where, in theory, I'm an expert on this stuff, but I had long running energy, problem. It generally felt good other than when I do like Brazilian jiu-jitsu or really hard workout. And those things just aren't super amenable to a low carb intake, particularly when you are under fueled with electrolytes, specifically sodium. And I just didn't know that. I never really got on my radar, but I started hanging out with Tyler Cartwright and Luis Villaseñor, the founders of Keto Gains. And after just ignoring their good advice for the better part of a year, they looked at what I was doing and they're like, you need more sodium. I'm like, oh, I salt my food, I'm good. And they rolled their eyes and they're like, okay, you will be back. We've had this conversation before. And when I fixed the problems that I was having with the adequate electrolytes, it was just amazing. And we knew that this was a problem that was facing most of the folks in the communities that we served. And so we spun up this thing called, it was a free downloadable guide to help you make your own electrolyte beverage, and we called it Keto Aid, and it was, this much table salt and this much potassium chloride, some magnesium citrate, lemon juice, stevia, water, shake it up, go. And we released that. And it was like 6 months later, we had 500,000 downloads of it. It was just going like crazy. And people started tagging us on social media, and they're like, hey, this stuff is awesome. But when I travel, TSA doesn't like the 3 bags of white powder I travel with. And so, is there, would you guys ever consider doing like a convenience thing, like a stick pack or something? And so we had no thought about spinning this thing up the way that we did, but we got really lucky. We identified a legitimate need within the health space, which is really looking at electrolytes. The funny thing with this too, I went in and did a big literature review of electrolyte physiology and renal physiology and hypertension and all this stuff. And it had been 20 years since I had looked at anything like this, like angiotensin, renin. I remembered the words. I didn't remember any of the specifics at all, but I went and looked at it with a completely fresh set of eyes. And I was like, these recommendations are ridiculous. Like, why would you recommend less than 2 grams of sodium per day for most people? And, it just seems crazy. And so that was a little over 3 years ago that we launched Element, and it's just been going crazy. Like we sell it pretty much all over the world at this point, and it's growing like crazy, and it has a great community feel to it. So thanks for asking about that. Like, it's been really cool, but I never in a million years would have thought that I'd be selling salt to people. Like, it just seemed crazy, but that's where we are.
Yeah, no, it's amazing, and it's interesting. I wonder whether you ever look back and sort of look at the evolution of where you started and where you're at now, and whether you would have imagined that that's where you'd be. So to sort of finish off by going, yeah, actually, I would have had no idea.
None at all.
Answers that question. None. Yeah. Yeah. Rob, thanks so much for your time this morning. And I really doubt that anyone would need to be reminded of where to find you, but where can we find you?
RobbWolf.com. And then I do a lot of writing over at drinkelement.com also. So those are kind of the 2 main places. I do have social media profiles. I don't do much on them. Like, I write something and then my assistant throws it up there for me because I just can't hang with the social media scene at this point. But that's kind of where to track me down. I do a weekly podcast with my wife called the Healthy Rebellion Radio. And so that's maybe something else if folks want to check that out.
That's awesome. And Rob, thank you so much for everything you do in this space. I don't know where you find the enthusiasm day after day after day, after all of these years, to continue to say the same things pretty much all of the time, but you also manage to bring such fresh information as well, and you're amazing. So thank you.
Thank you. I am just too dumb to quit. That's all there is.
All right, team, hopefully you enjoyed that. And it was such a treat to chat to Rob, who is someone which I have been a massive fan on for years and years. And if you don't already, absolutely check out the Healthy Rebellion Radio for some really good, sensible nutrition, health, and current climate conversations. And not only can you check out all of Rob's information in the show notes, you can also find more of him over on robbwolf.com. Next week on the podcast, I'm stoked to bring back a guest who's already been on, Lola Berry, to chat to her all about her book, Fearlessly Failing. It was so good to catch up with Lola. Until then, though, you can catch me over on Facebook at Mikki Williden Nutrition, over on Twitter and Instagram at Mikki Williden, or, as I previously said, over on MikkiWilliden.com, where not only can you sign up for one of those aforementioned food plans, you can also book a one-on-one consultation with me. All right, team, you have a great week and look forward to catching up next week.